The early morning sun peeked through the curtains of Frank Davidson's bedroom window. At exactly 6:30 a.m., just like every other morning for the past 40 years, the 93-year-old veteran opened his eyes. His body might have grown older, but his military discipline never left him. Frank slowly sat up in his bed, his joints creaking a bit as he moved. The walls of his bedroom were covered with old photographs, some in black and white, others in fading color. Most of them showed a younger Frank in his military uniform, standing proud with his fellow soldiers during World War II. Another day to keep moving forward, he mumbled to himself, a habit he developed after his wife, Mary, passed away 5 years ago. The house felt empty without her, but Frank refused to let loneliness take over his life. In the bathroom, he carefully combed his silver-white hair and put on his clean, pressed clothes. Even at his age, Frank believed in looking presentable. He adjusted his glasses and smiled at his reflection, remembering how Mary used to tease him about being so particular about his appearance. The veteran's cap sat on the dresser, its medals and pins shining in the morning light. Frank picked it up with gentle hands, placing it on his head with the same pride he felt when he first wore his military uniform. The cap had become part of his identity, a symbol of his service and sacrifice for his country. Walking down the hallway, Frank's eyes moved over the familiar pictures on the walls. Each one told a story: his wedding day with Mary, the birth of their children, family picnics, and holiday gatherings. Now his children had their own families and lived in different states, but they called him regularly and visited during holidays. In the kitchen, Frank followed his usual morning routine. He made his bed, cleaned his dishes from the night before, and checked his small calendar on the refrigerator. He had marked important dates: doctor's appointments, his children's visits, and the days he needed to tend to his garden. The garden was Frank's pride and joy. Through the kitchen window, he could see the rows of colorful flowers and vegetables he had planted. Mary had loved gardening, and after she passed away, Frank learned everything he could about plants to keep her memory alive. The neighbors often stopped to compliment his beautiful garden, and Frank would share vegetables with them, just like Mary used to do. At 7:15 a.m., Frank locked his front door and began his daily walk to Sally's Diner, 3 blocks away. He walked slowly but steadily, using his cane more for balance than support. Along the way, he greeted the morning joggers and people walking their dogs. Most of them knew him by name, and their friendly waves and smiles made him feel connected to his community. The bell above Sally's Diner door chimed as Frank entered. "Good morning, Mr. Davidson," called out Sarah, the young waitress who had been serving him breakfast for the past 2 years. She already had his usual table ready, the second booth from the window, where he could watch the town wake up. "Morning, Sarah," Frank replied with a warm smile. He didn't need to order anymore. Sarah knew he wanted 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and black coffee. As he waited for his breakfast, Frank pulled out the small notebook he always carried. In it, he wrote down his thoughts, memories, and sometimes letters to Mary that he never sent. Other regular customers at the diner would often stop by his table to chat. Frank enjoyed these conversations, sharing stories from his military days with those who asked, and listening to local news and gossip. The diner had become his second home, a place where he felt part of something bigger than his quiet house. As Frank sipped his coffee and watched the morning traffic through the window, he felt grateful for these simple routines that kept him going. At 93, he knew every day was a gift. His mind was sharp, his spirit was strong, and despite living alone, he had built a life filled with small but meaningful connections. Little did Frank know that this ordinary morning would be the last peaceful one he would have for a while. Soon, his quiet life would face an unexpected challenge that would force him to draw upon strengths he hadn't used in decades. Frank was working in his garden on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when he first heard the rumble. At first, it was just a distant sound, like rolling thunder. But unlike thunder, it grew louder and didn't stop. He stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked toward the empty lot next to his property. 5 motorcycles roared down the street, their engines so loud that Mrs. Thompson's cat ran for cover under Frank's porch. The bikes turned into the vacant lot that had been for sale for the past 2 years. Frank watched as more motorcycles followed, filling the peaceful afternoon with noise. "Well, that's different," Frank muttered to himself, squinting through his glasses at the group. He counted at least 15 motorcycles, their chrome parts gleaming in the sunlight. The riders were dressed in leather jackets with patches and logos he didn't recognize. The next morning, Frank noticed a large sign being put up on the empty lot. Iron Wolves MC, private property. Two muscular men in their 30s were securing the sign to metal posts. They had long beards and tattoos covering their arms. When they saw Frank watching, they stared back with unfriendly eyes. During his usual walk to Sally's diner, Frank saw more motorcycles parked outside the lot. Someone had brought in a shipping container and was converting it into some kind of clubhouse. The peaceful neighborhood he had known for decades was changing before his eyes. At the diner, Sarah noticed Frank seemed troubled. "Everything okay, Mr. Davidson?" she asked as she poured his coffee. "Those bikers moved in next door to my house," Frank replied, stirring his coffee slowly. "Quite a change from the quiet I'm used to." Other customers at the diner shared their own concerns. "I heard they're a new motorcycle club," said Bob, the local hardware store owner. "They've been causing trouble in other towns, making noise at all hours, racing on back roads." Frank's peaceful afternoon gardening was interrupted again when the bikers held their first official gathering. The noise was worse than before. Music blasted from speakers they had set up outside their clubhouse. Motorcycles came and went constantly, their engines revving unnecessarily loud. Some of the bikers started parking their motorcycles partially on Frank's property, right next to his carefully tended flower beds. The vibrations from their engines made his windows rattle, and the exhaust fumes drifted into his garden where he grew vegetables. That evening, Frank called his son James to tell them about the situation. "Maybe you should think about moving to Florida with Susan," James suggested, mentioning Frank's daughter. "You could have a nice quiet retirement there." But Frank shook his head, even though his son couldn't see him through the phone. "This is my home, son. Your mother and I built our life here. I'm not leaving because of some noisy neighbors." The next day, things got worse. As Frank walked to his mailbox, 3 motorcycles roared past him, so close that the wind from their passing almost knocked him off balance. He'd heard laughter as they circled back and did it again. When Frank checked his garden later, he found motorcycle tracks through his flower bed. The petunias Mary had loved so much were crushed under tire marks. His hands shook as he knelt to assess the damage, but it wasn't from fear, it was from anger. That night, Frank couldn't sleep because of the noise from the lot. The bikers were having what seemed like a party, with loud music and constant motorcycle engines revving. He sat in his living room, looking at old photographs of himself during the war, particularly ones showing him with his military motorcycle. As he traced the outline of his younger self in the photo, Frank remembered the skills he had learned, the respect he had earned, and the discipline that had kept him alive during the war. These young bikers might think he was just a helpless old man, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Looking out his window at the chaos next door, Frank made a decision. Tomorrow, he would try to talk to them peacefully, but if they wouldn't listen to reason, well, they were about to learn that this old veteran had more than gardening skills in his past. The next morning, Frank put on his best shirt and his veteran's cap. He had decided to handle things the proper way, with a polite conversation. Walking carefully across his lawn, he made his way to the bikers' clubhouse. 3 young men were outside, working on their motorcycles. "Good morning," Frank said, standing as straight as his old back would allow. "I'm Frank Davidson, your neighbor. Could I speak with whoever's in charge?" One of the bikers, a tall man with a snake tattoo on his neck, looked up and smirked. "What's the matter, old-timer? Our bike's too loud for your afternoon nap." Frank kept his voice steady. "Actually, yes, and you've been parking on my property. Some of your friends drove through my garden yesterday. I'd appreciate it if we could work something out." The door of the clubhouse opened, and a bigger man walked out. He had a patch on his leather vest that read Snake, President. The other bikers stepped back as he approached Frank. "Listen, Gramps," Snake said, walking in a circle around Frank. "This is our territory now. We do what we want, when we want. That veteran's cap doesn't make you special." Frank felt his face grow hot, but he stayed calm. "I fought for this country so people like you could have freedom. All I'm asking is for some respect and consideration." The bikers burst out laughing. Snake picked up Frank's garden hose lying nearby and sprayed water at Frank's feet, making him step back to avoid getting wet. "Hey boys, look. The old man's doing a dance for us." Frank's clothes were splashed with mud, but he stood his ground. "My father taught me that only cowards pick on those they think are weaker," he said quietly. Snake's face turned red with anger. "What did you say, old man?" He stepped closer to Frank, towering over him. "You calling us cowards?" "I'm saying there's a difference between being tough and being mean," Frank replied, looking straight into Snake's eyes. "Right now, you're just being mean." Later that day, Frank found his mailbox knocked over. The next morning, more motorcycle tracks crossed his garden, this time destroying his tomato plants. The noise got worse, with bikers deliberately revving their engines when passing his house, sometimes in the middle of the night. At Sally's diner, Sarah noticed Frank looked tired. "They're still giving you trouble, Mr. Davidson?" she asked, bringing him extra coffee. "Nothing I can't handle," Frank said, but his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. He hadn't slept well in days because of the noise. The final straw came 3 days later. Frank returned from his morning walk to find spray paint on his fence. Someone had written, "Old G. Isidore," in big red letters. But what hurt most was what they'd done to his special garden spot. In the corner of his yard, Frank had planted Mary's favorite flowers, yellow roses and white lilies. It was his memorial to her, with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Mary Davidson, beloved wife." The bikers had driven right through it, crushing the flowers and knocking over the plaque. Frank stood there for a long time, looking at the destroyed memorial. His neighbors watched from their windows as he slowly picked up the broken plaque, his shoulders shaking. They thought he was crying, but they were wrong. That evening, Frank sat in his garage, looking at something covered by an old tarp. He hadn't touched it in years, but he'd kept it in perfect condition. His hands weren't shaking anymore. There was a calm look in his eyes that would have worried anyone who knew him well. "Mary always said I was too patient," he muttered to himself, pulling the tarp back slightly. The chrome underneath still gleamed like new. Maybe it's time to show these young fellows what a real rider looks like. In the lot next door, the bikers were having another loud party. They thought they had won, that they had broken the old man's spirit. They had no idea that in his garage, Frank Davidson was making plans that would change everything. Tomorrow, they would learn why you should never underestimate a veteran, especially one with a secret. Late that night, alone in his garage, Frank Davidson pulled the old tarp completely off his treasured secret. There stood his 1942 Indian Scout motorcycle, its midnight blue paint and chrome detailing still perfect after all these years. He ran his hand along the leather seat, memories flooding back from his wartime days. "Been a while, old friend," he whispered, walking around the vintage motorcycle. Unlike modern bikes, this machine had history, real history. Frank had ridden it across the battlefields of the Pacific during World War II, serving as a motorcycle scout for his unit. As he cleaned the already spotless chrome with a soft cloth, Frank's mind drifted back to 1943. He had been just 20 years old when the Army discovered his natural talent for motorcycle riding. They made him a scout, responsible for running messages between units and gathering information about enemy positions. The Indian Scout wasn't just any motorcycle, it was specially modified for military use. Frank had learned every inch of it, how to ride it silently when needed, how to maneuver it through impossible terrain. His fellow soldiers had nicknamed him the Ghost because of how quietly he could move through enemy territory. Frank opened an old wooden chest in the corner of his garage. Inside was his leather riding jacket, still strong despite its age. Under it lay photographs he rarely showed anyone, pictures of him with his motorcycle in the Pacific. One showed him teaching other soldiers advanced riding techniques. Another captured him receiving a special commendation for a dangerous night mission. Lieutenant Frank Davidson, he read from the old commendation letter, demonstrated extraordinary skill and courage by completing a vital reconnaissance mission under heavy enemy fire. He smiled, remembering how young and scared he had been, but how the motorcycle had felt like an extension of his own body. There were newspaper clippings too, yellowed with age. One headline read, "Army Scouts Motorcycle Skills Save Platoon." Frank had used his riding abilities to lead his unit through a dangerous mountain pass, avoiding an enemy ambush. Another article described how he had modified his Indian Scout to run almost silently for night missions. Sarah from the diner would never guess that the quiet old man who ordered eggs every morning had once set a speed record on his motorcycle while delivering urgent messages between military bases. The young bikers next door had no idea that the old geezer they mocked had trained an elite unit of motorcycle scouts. Frank pulled out his old riding boots from the chest, The leather was still supple. He had cared for them just like he cared for his motorcycle. He remembered the special techniques he had developed. How to ride through water without stalling, how to jump small obstacles, how to use the terrain to hide both bike and rider. His hands found a small metal box at the bottom of the chest. Inside were his medals, including a special citation for exceptional motorcycle scout services. There was also a worn notebook filled with diagrams and notes about advanced riding techniques that he had developed during the war. Colonel Patterson said I was the best rider he'd ever seen, Frank murmured, looking at a photo of himself with his commanding officer. Said I could make that Indian Scout dance like it was alive. Standing up slowly, Frank walked back to his motorcycle. He checked the engine. He had maintained it perfectly all these years, starting it regularly and keeping all parts in working order. The special modifications he had made for silent running were still in place. The leather saddlebags still held his old tools and emergency repair kit. Looking out his garage window toward the biker's lot, Frank could see them partying as usual. They rode their modern motorcycles with power, but no skill, with noise, but no purpose. They thought motorcycle riding was about being loud and intimidating. Tomorrow, Frank said quietly, patting his Indian Scout's handlebars, we'll show them what real riding looks like. We'll show them what years of experience and training mean. He covered the motorcycle again, but not before making sure everything was ready for tomorrow. As he turned off the garage light, Frank felt younger somehow. The aches in his joints seemed less noticeable. Tomorrow would change everything. But first, he needed one good night's sleep. The bikers had no idea that the quiet old neighbor they had been tormenting was actually a legend in the motorcycle world. They were about to learn that some skills never fade, and that wisdom and experience could beat raw power any day. The sun had barely risen when Frank woke up the next morning. He skipped his usual walk to Sally's diner. Today was different. Instead of his normal breakfast routine, he made himself a strong cup of coffee and walked to his garage. His hands were steady as he unlocked the door. "Today's the day, old friend," he said to his Indian Scout as he removed the tarp. The morning light caught the chrome just right, making the vintage motorcycle gleam like new. Frank had spent most of the night thinking about what he was about to do. From his wooden chest, he pulled out his old leather riding jacket. The leather was still soft and strong, maintained with the same care he gave his garden. When he put it on, it fit like it was made yesterday. The familiar weight on his shoulders brought back memories of countless missions. "Mary would probably tell me I'm being silly," Frank muttered, but then he looked at the broken plaque from her memorial garden lying on his workbench. His face hardened. No, this wasn't silly. This was about respect, about standing up to bullies. Frank began his preparation carefully. First, he checked every part of the motorcycle, the engine, the brakes, the special modifications he had made during the war. Everything was perfect, just as he kept it. He filled the tank with fresh fuel he had stored specially for his Indian Scout. The old veteran then changed into his riding clothes. Under his leather jacket, he wore a clean white shirt. He put on his riding boots, which he had polished the night before. Looking in the mirror he kept in the garage, Frank barely recognized himself. The old man who fed birds in the garden was gone. In his place stood a military motorcycle scout, ready for action. Around 10 a.m., the bikers started arriving at their clubhouse next door. Frank could hear their loud motorcycles, their laughing, their music. He waited patiently, checking and double-checking everything. Timing would be important. Sarah from the diner called his home phone, worried when he hadn't shown up for breakfast. "I'm fine, Sarah," he assured her. "Just busy with something important today." After he hung up, he could imagine her concerned face. She'd understand soon enough. By noon, the bikers' gathering was in full swing. Frank could hear Snake, their leader, shouting and laughing. Through his garage window, he saw them doing wheelies on the street, showing off their motorcycle tricks. Some of them rode past his house, revving their engines extra loud as usual. Frank took his time. He combed his white hair neatly and put on his old riding cap, not his usual veteran's cap, but the special one he had worn during his scout missions. He strapped on his riding gloves, flexing his fingers until the leather felt natural again. "This isn't about revenge," he told himself, looking at Mary's picture on his workbench. "This is about teaching them something about respect." He could almost hear Mary's voice telling him to be careful, but also seeing that spark in her eye that had always appeared when he stood up for what was right. The afternoon sun was high when Frank decided it was time. You could hear the bikers were at their rowdiest, showing off for some new members who had arrived. Perfect timing. You wanted an audience for what he was about to do. Frank pressed the garage door button, and for the first time in years, the door opened with his Indian Scout facing the world. He sat on the familiar leather seat, feeling like he was greeting an old friend. The key slid into the ignition. When he turned it, the engine purred to life like it had been waiting for this moment. The sound was different from the harsh roar of the bikers' modern motorcycles. This was the smooth, powerful purr of a well-maintained classic. Taking a deep breath, Frank revved the engine once, letting its distinctive sound echo across the neighborhood. Through his garage window, he saw several bikers turn their heads, curious about the unfamiliar sound. "Okay, old friend," Frank patted the motorcycle's tank. "Let's show these young fellows what real riding looks like." His heart was beating faster, but his hands were steady on the handlebars. The moment of truth had arrived, and Frank Davidson was ready to surprise everyone who thought he was just a helpless old man. The sound of Frank's Indian Scout rolling out of his garage made every head turn in the biker's lot. The afternoon sun caught the chrome perfectly, making the vintage motorcycle shine like a jewel. The bikers stopped their activities, staring at the unexpected sight. Frank rode slowly, deliberately, his leather jacket and cap giving him an air of authority that made even Snake, the biker's leader, stand straighter. The Indian Scout's engine purred smoothly, its sound completely different from the harsh roar of modern bikes. Well, Snake called out, trying to sound tough but unable to hide his surprise. "Look who decided to join us. Grandpa's got himself a toy." The other bikers laughed, but their laughter seemed uncertain. Frank stopped his motorcycle in the middle of their gathering. With practiced ease, he put down the kickstand and dismounted. His movements were smooth, showing years of experience. He stood tall, looking nothing like the old gardener they had been bullying. "Nice antique," one of the younger bikers said, walking around the Indian Scout. "Museum piece, right?" He reached out to touch it, but Frank's voice stopped him. "That antique has seen more action than all your bikes combined," Frank said clearly, his voice carrying across the lot. "This is a 1942 Indian Scout, modified for military scout missions during World War II. Snake pushed through the crowd, trying to take control of the situation. "What do you want, old man? Coming here to show off your old bike won't change anything." Frank smiled slightly. "I'm here to make you a deal, young man." He looked directly at Snake. "A riding challenge. If I win, you and your club start showing some respect, not just to me, but to everyone in this neighborhood." The bikers broke into laughter, but Snake held up his hand to quiet them. "And if you lose?" he asked, smirking. "If I lose," Frank patted his motorcycle's seat, "you get my Indian Scout. It's worth more than all your bikes put together." This got their attention. Several bikers whispered among themselves, recognizing the value of the vintage motorcycle. Snake stepped closer, examining the perfectly maintained machine. "Deal," Snake said, extending his hand. "But I set up the course and the challenges." Frank shook his hand firmly. "That's fine by me." Snake quickly set up a complex course in and around their lot. He included tight turns, weaving sections, and even some rough terrain at the back of the property. 3 challenges, he announced. Precision riding through the cones, slow speed control, and finally, the full course at speed. The crowd of bikers grew as word spread. Some locals gathered too, including Sarah from the diner, who watched nervously from across the street. Snake went first, showing off on his modern motorcycle. He was good, probably the best rider in his club. Then it was Frank's turn. He put on his riding gloves calmly, started his Indian Scout, and took position. What happened next left everyone speechless. Frank didn't just ride through the course, he made his motorcycle dance. In the precision section, he weaved through cones so smoothly it looked like flowing water. During the slow speed challenge, he balanced his motorcycle at near stopping speed, something even Snake couldn't do. But it was the final challenge where Frank truly showed his skills. He took the full course at speed, but with a control that made it look effortless. He didn't just turn between obstacles, he glided. He didn't just ride over rough ground, he floated. "That's impossible," one biker whispered. "Nobody can ride like that, especially not on an old bike." Frank completed the course in faster time than Snake, but it wasn't just about speed. It was about grace, control, and mastery that came from decades of experience. When he finally stopped and turned off his engine, there was complete silence in the lot. Snake stood with his mouth open, his earlier arrogance gone. The other bikers looked at Frank with new eyes, seeing not an old gardener, but a master rider who had just schooled them all. Frank dismounted slowly, removed his riding cap, and looked at Snake. "So," he said quietly, "about that deal we made." The silence in the lot was broken by slow, spreading applause. It started with Sarah from the diner and spread to the gathering crowd of neighbors. Even some of the bikers joined in, clearly impressed by what they had just witnessed. Snake stood quietly for a moment, then walked up to Frank. How? How did you learn to ride like that?" The arrogance was gone from his voice, replaced by genuine curiosity. Frank leaned against his Indian scout and began to share his story. "In 1943, I was a motorcycle scout in the Pacific. This very motorcycle carried me through enemy territory, through jungles, across beaches, and over mountains. When your life depends on riding quietly and skillfully, you learn things they don't teach in motorcycle shops." The bikers gathered around closer, their attitudes completely changed. Frank pointed to different parts of his motorcycle, explaining the special modifications he had made during the war. "See this exhaust system? I designed it myself for silent running. And these foot pegs? Modified them for better control during slow-speed maneuvers." "But that turn you made, the one where you barely leaned the bike," one young biker asked. "How did you do that?" Frank smiled and walked over to his motorcycle. "Let me show you." He started the engine and demonstrated the technique again, this time explaining each movement. The bikers watched in amazement as he controlled the heavy vintage motorcycle with the lightest touch. For the next hour, Frank shared more of his knowledge. He showed them how to balance at extremely slow speeds, how to read the terrain before riding over it, and how to make their motorcycles respond to subtle commands. The younger riders tried to copy his techniques, with Frank offering patient guidance. Snake, who had been quietly watching, finally spoke up. "Mr. Davidson, I owe you an apology. We all do. We thought because you were old." He stopped, embarrassed. "Age is just a number," Frank said kindly. "It's experience that counts, and respect, for your machine, for others, and for yourself." As the afternoon went on, more of Frank's story came out. He showed them the old photographs from his military days, explained the missions he had undertaken, and described how motorcycle scouts had played a crucial role in the war effort. "This isn't just about showing off or making noise," Frank explained, pointing to his Indian scout. "A motorcycle can be a tool, a companion, even a lifesaver. It's all in how you use it." The change in the bikers was remarkable. They asked questions about maintenance, about riding techniques, about the history of motorcycles. Some of them admitted they had never really learned the finer points of riding, focusing instead on speed and noise. Sarah brought over coffee and sandwiches from the diner, and the gathering turned into an impromptu teaching session. Frank demonstrated more techniques, this time showing how to ride quietly, a skill that impressed even the most experienced bikers. "I never knew you could make a motorcycle so quiet," one of them admitted. "Always thought louder was better. In war," Frank explained, "noise could get you killed. I learned to move like a ghost on this machine. It's not about how much noise you make, it's about how well you control your bike." As the sun began to set, the bikers had a different look in their eyes. The respect they now showed wasn't just because Frank had won the challenge. It was because he had shown them what true mastery looked like. One young biker raised his hand like a student in class. "Mr. Davidson, could you teach us more? Like, regularly?" Frank looked around at the earnest faces, so different from the mocking ones he had seen just days before. He thought about Mary, about how she always said every bad situation was a chance to make something good happen. "Well," he said with a smile, "I suppose I could. But first, we need to fix up that garden you fellows rode through. A good rider respects more than just their motorcycle." The bikers nodded eagerly, and Frank knew that something special was beginning. What had started as a challenge was turning into an opportunity to pass on decades of knowledge to a new generation. 3 months had passed since Frank's showdown with the bikers, and the neighborhood had changed in ways no one could have expected. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club was still there, But it was completely different now. Every Saturday morning, Frank would find a group of eager bikers waiting in his driveway, ready for what they called the Veterans Riding School. He taught them everything he knew, from basic maintenance to advanced riding techniques. His Indian Scout became a teaching tool, showing them how motorcycles had evolved over the decades. Remember, Frank would say, walking between their parked motorcycles, it's not about how loud you can be, it's about how much control you have. The bikers listened respectfully, taking notes and practicing his techniques. The club made changes to their property too. They built a proper practice area where Frank could teach them. The loud parties were replaced with organized riding events. They even put up a new sign, Iron Wolves NC, home of the Davidson Riding Academy. Snake, who had once been Frank's biggest troublemaker, became his most dedicated student. He spent hours learning about Frank's wartime experiences and the history of motorcycle scouts. Mr. D, he would say, tell us again about that night mission in the Pacific. The garden that had been destroyed was now more beautiful than ever. The bikers had helped Frank rebuild it, adding new flowers and even building a proper memorial area for Mary. They kept their motorcycles well away from it, and sometimes brought flowers to add to the collection. Sarah at the diner now had to reserve extra tables every morning, as bikers would join Frank for breakfast, listening to his stories and asking for advice. The other customers got used to seeing leather-clad men sitting quietly with the old veteran, discussing everything from motorcycle maintenance to life lessons. One sunny afternoon, Frank got a surprise visit from his son James. "Dad," James said, looking around at the transformed neighborhood, "when you said you were handling the situation, this isn't exactly what I expected." Frank smiled as they watched a group of bikers carefully practicing slow-speed maneuvers in the lot. "Sometimes, son, the best way to change people is to share what you know with them. These young folks just needed someone to show them a better way." The Iron Wolves started a community service program, using their riding skills to help others. They escorted charity rides, delivered supplies to elderly neighbors, and even started a motorcycle safety course for local teenagers. Frank's influence had turned them from troublemakers into respected community members. "You know what's funny?" Snake said one day, helping Frank clean his Indian Scout. "We thought we were tough guys, but real toughness isn't about making noise and scaring people. It's about skill, respect, and helping others. You taught us that, Mr. T." The local newspaper did a story about the transformation. They took a photo of Frank on his Indian Scout, surrounded by his leather-clad students. The headline read, "93-year-old veteran transforms motorcycle club through wisdom and skill." Frank kept Mary's picture in the garage where he taught, and sometimes he would tell the bikers about her. "She would have loved this," he'd say with a smile. "She always said everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." On Frank's 94th birthday, the Iron Wolves organized a surprise party. They presented him with a special leather jacket, with honorary Iron Wolf, Master Rider, stitched on the back. But their biggest surprise was unveiling a new scholarship fund they had created in his name, helping veterans learn motorcycle maintenance and riding skills. "You didn't just teach us about motorcycles," Snake said during the party, his voice emotional. "You taught us about respect, about community, about being better men. You could have called the police on us, but instead, you chose to teach us." Frank looked around at his transformed neighborhood, the peaceful lot next door, the beautiful garden, and most importantly, the group of reformed bikers who now called him Mr. D with genuine respect and affection. "Life's funny," he said to Mary's picture that evening. "Sometimes the worst trouble leads to the best changes. These boys thought they were giving an old man a hard time, but instead, they gave me a new purpose. And I think we all learned something about respect along the way."